Welcome back to the second half of the afternoon. As Bill said, money laundering is not only an economic or a criminal problem, it also has security implications. It has implications for our rule of law, the openness in our societies, and what policy we conduct. We're going to have a little panel discussion. We have a very distinguished panel here who will give some short initial reflections. And then we open up for a discussion session with Bill, as well as some more time with questions and answers. So with us today, we're having Karin Olsson, who is cultural editor of Expressen, who's written very well in things touching Russia. We have Olof Ehrenkrona, he has such a long CV that I'm only going to focus on the latest ones. He is currently editorial writer at Svenska Dagbladet, he's consul general and the CEO of Järnverk. And last but absolutely not least, we have Patrik Oksanen, who is political editor for the Mittmedia concern for a number of regional newspapers, as well as author on a book of Russian disinformation, which I strongly recommend, and an award-winning journalist. I'm also missing a couple of things in your bio. We're going to give the floor first to Karin, and then to Olof, and then to Patrik, and then we'll open it up for more of a discussion. So go ahead, Karin.
Okay, and my microphone is working, yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Bill Browder. Even though I know the story, it's heartbreaking to hear it live like this, so thank you.
Thanks for doing this in English. I know this is for my benefit, since you all speak Swedish.
So you are training us.
Yeah. So I've been asked to share some insights on this topic as a journalist, and the role of media is obvious. We heard Bill here talking about the Danish paper Berlingske in Denmark, who worked hard to expose the immorality of Danske Bank, and public service television, SVT, have invested a lot of time and effort to break the news about Swedbank. So the media is, of course, has a very important task in this. But I would also like to remind you about the annual report from Säpo, the Swedish Secret Service, which recently was released. It's of course about the threats against Sweden, and they note this year that Russia continues to perpetrate cyber espionage and influence operations, among other activities. And according to the report, it's easy to influence politics today, which has led to an increase in propaganda and rendered the political discourse more vulnerable to manipulation. Increased vigilance is necessary, Säpo writes. And I think the public in general, and Swedish journalists in particular, have hugely improved their levels of awareness regarding influence operations in the past 2 years. And I think Donald Trump's suspected dealings with Russia during the US election campaign has been very educational for us in terms of what forces can collaborate to sabotage democratic processes. And during the Swedish election this past fall, every editorial offer worth its salt trained the reporters and editors in informational influence with an emphasis on Russia. And I thought much of the naivety was on its way out, that journalists had the tools they needed. And that may be true to some extent. But just recently we have seen Sweden's largest news site, Aftonbladet, accuse Swedish researcher Martin Krag of being a British spy in what appears to be a Russian influencing campaign involving hacked documents in Britain. The culture editor of Aftonbladet went so far as to call for Säpo to investigate him. And Martin Krag is a Russia expert of the younger generation, and torpedoing his credibility would be in Russia's interest. To some extent, Aftonbladet has apologized for making these wild accusations, but several lies remain. They can be Googled by anyone for years to come. This past week, Aftonbladet's publisher said that she had continued confidence in the editor who wrote the accusations. So whoever was behind the hacking operation can be satisfied. A few names on a paper on the internet set off speculation in several countries, sowed doubt and generated countless news articles about alleged secret memberships in British, supposedly shady networks. A scholar in Norway, Tor Bukkvold, at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, whose name also appeared in the leaked documents, commented in Norwegian news media that he does not know if it's possible to leave an organization one never joined. The quote illustrates the impossible position one can find oneself in when used in a Russian influence campaign. If one protests, one automatically contributes to spreading the lies. If one doesn't, the allegation will remain on Google uncontested. Either way, Russia wins. We talk a lot about money laundering right now in Sweden for obvious reasons. We talk about rebuild our military defense. This is of tremendous importance. But at times I think that maintaining to a grasp on the truth also will be a great challenge to a liberal, open society like us, especially, of course, in the digital age. To not let us ourselves become infected by insidious propaganda that can affect elections, public discourse, and in the long run, even policy making. So that is my reflection on the topic of today. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Karin. And it is indeed a fascinating development where information that seemed to have been hacked by ERU, amplified by RT and Sputnik, somehow ends up in Sweden's biggest newspaper with the title "Martin Krag is a democratic problem." And if you know how Google works, it's the biggest newspaper. That's the first thing that comes up for Martin. I'm very happy, though, to say that there has been a backlash this time. Got to pass the word over to Olof.
Yes, I think it's extremely important that we understand that what Bill is describing and what Karin is describing and what Patrik has been describing in Swedish press for many years now is that we see not only a organized criminality or organized economic crimes. What we see is a political operation. It's a political operation that uses the economic means in order to promote Russian and Kremlin interests. And of course, one of those interests is, of course, that they want to enrich themselves. That goes with the message. But they know that in order to be able to do this, they need to be able to influence politics in the open and free West. And this is what we are seeing. This is probably what we have seen during the Brexit campaign. It's probably what we have seen in the American presidential election campaign. It's probably what we have seen in Sweden, what we have seen in Finland, what we have seen in France. The modus are slightly different. If you look at Finland and Sweden, there has been a modus of buying property in order to use them as laundromats, of course, but also to give some sort of pivot for further use. And what is an important aspect of the situation in Russia is that the money laundering is not only an issue for oligarchs, it's not only an issue for private money, it's also a way for the security organs to buy influence in the Western world. It's a part of the political operation where the security organs are one of the actors. And of course they act in the interest of higher authorities in the Kremlin. But also of course they act as a part of the competition between the different organs. So the different organs compete with themselves in order to get influence. What we see is enormous amount of money laundering, but we also see, and this was not the case in the same extent during the Cold War, we see actually killings. They are killing people in the Western world in order to promote their interest. We got disturbing news about Mikhail Lesin, the late days, about the Moroccan model who was found to have too much amount of cadmium in her body and traces of other radioactive materials in her clothing. We have the Skripal case, we have Litvinenko, and of course we have the cases in Russia as well. Nemtsov, Politkovskaya, you name it. A year ago, we had a meeting in Tallinn with Russian journalists and Russian media, and I met one of the persons who worked at Khodorkovsky, and I asked, they were there with small kids, everyone. They were young people. And I asked them, how is it? You're risking your life, obviously. Well, I've been poisoned twice, he said. The last time I had 5% chance to stay alive. I took those 5% and moved to the US. This is the reality. This is the guy that we are dealing with. And they do it because they want them to be us. They want us to be like them. They know that the open, transparent, democratic, free, honest society is the gravest threat to them and to their money and to their activities and to their power. And in order to reduce this threat, in order to diminish this threat, they try to influence our politics and to buy allies in our own system. And they have allies. Until 2015, the Vice President of Bank of Cyprus, he's now Secretary of Commerce in US. We know the role that Deutsche Bank is playing in this laundromat circus, and we know who saved the acting president of the United States when he had economic troubles. We have good reasons to believe that a big part of the financing of the Brexit campaign came from Russia. And they have a definite political interest to diminish the influence of the European Union, both globally and, of course, in Europe. So I think it's extremely important that we understand that it is, I would say it's a war, but it's definitely a political operation that is directed against our most fundamental interests. And what Bill is describing is one of the means for Kremlin to do this. And therefore, it is so extremely important that we use our means, rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, transparency, free media, in order to fight this. We will always be later than them, but in the long run, our own institutions are the best safeguard in this fight. And it is an existential fight.
Thank you very much for that, Olof. And if I would summarize it, I would say a little bit that money, and often illicit, is really the engine of Russians' political operations and a way of influencing us. Patrik, your thoughts?
Thank you very much for having me, and Mr. Browder, thank you for your brave fight for justice and liberty. And I think that is a very important part that you bring to the table for this discussion, the money. We must realize that we are right now losing, and we have been losing for quite a while. And it's a combination about our own greed, as you illustrate with the banks, getting money from dealing with the crooks from Russia. And then they used this money also for all sorts of purpose that are hurting our society. And we heard about the disinformation campaigns and targeting people. And I think the most chilling part of the campaign against Martin Krogh that actually came in an article supporting him, where the authors, academics, professors in Sweden stated that more wanted to resign but they didn't dare. Fear is spreading, and I've met journalists as well that don't want to engage with issues concerning Russian influence because of fear. I've met people in Swedish media companies stating that, oh, this is so complex and so threatening that I don't know how we should ever be able to handle it. So things are actually working pretty well for Russia. And meanwhile, we are fighting each other in order to in all complex issues. Brexit, we're seeing the Britain is going down in front of our eyes in the British Parliament right now, not being able to sort out the Brexit mess, just because of what happened in that referendum. So we're losing right now, and we need to get our things together, and we need to get it pretty fast together, because things are moving very rapidly. And I would say, on a more pessimistic note, that we are perhaps 2 or 3 big multiple crises away from a breakdown of the Western liberal world order. And that is a situation that a small democratic country close to Russia do not want to have. That's a world that we do not want to live in. And to tie this now back to Sweden, this week VLT, a newspaper in the Mittmedia News Group in Västerås, have reported about the construction of the first church of the Moscow Patriarch in Sweden, a couple of 100 meters from Västerås airport. And one bill in that construction has been financed from the company where the priest was CEO, a company that has been taxed extra by the Swedish tax authorities for, I think it was 14 million Swedish crowns, because they have had false billings. And experts looking at that decision from tax authorities states it looks like money laundering, or what you do when you want to hide money for other purposes. So we have money coming somewhere from. We don't know exactly where this money come from the beginning, but we see the effects on the ground, on a local level. And also in this story, you have naivety in the local process of getting the construction there, and you have had 2 persons in the political body involved with this congregation of the Moscow Patriarch in the decision-making body of the local government. So we're seeing this destroying our society, and it's going on 24/7 just in front of our eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrik. So I will pose the question first to the panel, and Bill touched upon it a bit. So if we all can agree that it's a good idea that criminals are held accountable, and that Russia is a threat to Sweden in any way, which all our public documents subscribe to, why is it so hard for us in Sweden to adopt a Magnitsky Act? And meanwhile, you think a little bit about that in the panel. I'm going to give Bill the chance to reflect a little bit on what's been said so far.
Well, I would say it's hard for any country to adopt a Magnitsky Act, and the main reason it is hard is that every government goes to its foreign ministry to ask, should we or should we not do this? And every foreign ministry in every country, the State Department is not called the State Department, but every other country is called a foreign ministry. Their job is to do everything possible to have smooth relations with every country that they interact with in the world. And so their objectives are completely contrary to the idea of holding countries accountable. And if you were to have an off-the-record, behind-the-scenes conversation, they would all say that, and I've had some of those off-the-record, behind-the-scenes conversations. And so you're constantly struggling with the experts, the people who are dealing with these foreign countries, telling you that you absolutely should not do this because it just doesn't make any sense. And you combine that with the history of realpolitik, where people say that everybody's bad, and so why should we get involved with this whole, you can't change the world, so let's just try to make do. And that makes for a pretty big mountain to try to climb, or a big obstacle to overcome. My counter argument to that is that you can perfectly easily have diplomatic relations with Russia at the same time as you sanction 42 Russian individuals involved in an atrocity in Russia. And the two are not mutually exclusive. And the best example of that is it actually wasn't even Russia, it was Saudi Arabia. America's biggest ally is Saudi Arabia. And after the Khashoggi murder, America put 17 Saudis, not Mohammed bin Salman, but 17 other Saudis on the Magnitsky list. And so it's possible to have diplomatic relations and at the same time sanction individuals who do terrible things.
I basically agree with you. The signal is very strong, but I think there are some complicating factors in Europe, and I can say also in Sweden. And one is that we don't have a legal tradition that actually targets individuals in other countries. It's a bit different in the US. You had this type of sanctions after the Second World War, for example. But that has not been a part of the Swedish legal structure, and that makes it, I would say, more difficult to implement here and in other European countries as well. It doesn't mean that should be a definite obstacle, but I think that is one explanation why it takes some time, and it's also one explanation why some countries can see that it's easier if we have some sort of European policy here that is common for all. But it takes me over to another issue, and that is what has happened is that the Western world is attractive for Russian money because here you have protect them.
Yeah.
They take the money from Russia where there is no protection at all, and take them here where they are protected. And that is a consequence of the fact that we are rule of law based societies, and the rule of law is also rule of law that is applied to foreign citizens as well to our own citizens. And I think it was in 2015 or so that Anders Åslund wrote a report from the Atlantic Council about how Russia misuses and manipulates our own legal systems in order to promote their shady interests. And this is a problem that we have to deal with. And I think that we have been, I wouldn't say naive, but we have been not enough on our toes in order to actually change our system in order to be able to fight this kind of manipulation and the misuse of our systems. You have a number of cases in American courts where the Russians are promoting very, very shady interests, and we have some cases also here in Sweden where they are doing it. And they do not respect rule of law by themselves, and of course that we should have some sort of reciprocity here from our side.
Yeah, now if you look at the case of Ariston Helby in the Finnish archipelago, we had a Russian-connected company making harbors, having helipads, and a number of islands close to military installations. One of the main charges brought against us was money laundering. It wasn't, preparation for a military coup or anything. It was money laundering. So if there's political will, it's of course an incredibly politically useful tool to work with.
It was very fun because I was sitting with the Finnish president and discussing Russia. Actually, I think it was 2 days before this police was striking, and we know that the president was informed. And he said, when it comes to Russia and dealing with Russia in Finland, we know that we need to have everything fixed when we talk with the Russians, because we have this saying that the Cossack takes everything that is loose. And then 2 days later, you open up the new bulletin and you saw that, oh my God, now they have fixed Åland archipelago back again with this striking. And I think it was very illustrating on how you could act as a country without putting it in a framing that could officially annoy Russia.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, and it's fascinating as well with the Magnitsky Act that almost all of our closest partners had adopted any kind of version with it. The US, the UK, the Baltic states. It is being worked on now, encouraged on the European level, and yet we are having, if I don't get my metaphors incorrect here, using the EU as a fig leaf that we're hiding behind because the EU it will be very hard to reach unity there. I will open the floor a little bit. We'll take a few questions, and then we'll go around a bit more on the panel. So, as always, indicate if you're having anything.
Can I add
Yeah,
to
sure.
about
Go.
the Finnish case? I think the Finnish case is very interesting because the Finns are using exactly the same method as Russians. They say no politics, it's just money laundering. You have committed crimes, we have to deal with this. This is exactly the same technique as the Russians are using. And of course, the Finns made it very clear to the Russians, we see what you are doing and we are not accepting it.
There's one difference, though. The Russians make up fake evidence to accuse people of money
Yeah,
laundering.
Yeah,
that's a big difference, of course.
exactly. I'm going to give the word to the chairman of Free Will Forum.
Just a reflection about what Olof said about we don't have that tradition of legislation, and that is of course right. But I'm thinking, Bill mentioned very many times in your speech the word asymmetrical, and we know there is asymmetrical warfare and all this asymmetries you were talking about. But we do also have another problem, that is we have an asymmetrical view on how our societies are working, because we believe in some way that in another country you have the rule of law. It might be in a bad shape or in a bad structure or a dictatorship, etc. But still you have the same playing field in some way. But what has happened, and during the Cold War this was okay because then we had containment. Now we have something that we could call diffusion. I mean, everything is mixed up, and what is resting in the shades over there can operate here. So in some way, we need to prepare ourselves in order to defend free societies, to the fact that we are living in an asymmetrical world. And it would be interesting to hear the panel comment on that, because that is forcing us to act in another way. It is not about facing warfare. It is as well. It is facing all the things that are below here, and that are in some way safeguarded in the shades and in the asymmetry of another system of society.
That's right.
Who wants to go?
Okay, you go, Bill, and then go, Patrik.
So another one of my collaborators who stands on my side of the barricade is Garry Kasparov, the famous chess player, and he's got this great expression that going forward with Russia, we're not going to fight them with tanks, we're going to fight them in the banks, and that's a very catchy phrase. But it comes back to what some of you said, which is doesn't matter what the traditions. If we just stick to the traditions, nothing. We're not going to be able to deal with this with this asymmetric warfare. Russia doesn't have. So the size of the Russian military is 90% less than the size of the U.S. military, and 80% of their military spending gets stolen. So it's really 2% of the U.S. military budget. It's if you look at the non-stolen Russian, it's about equal to the British military budget, so Russia doesn't have any capacity to stand up to any kind of major Western military conflict, and so everything that they do is going to be asymmetric. It's going to be done in a plausibly deniable way, and they've discovered, and it's really remarkable. They've discovered that you spend a few $100 million. And you can instead of spending tens of billions of dollars on military, you can spend a few $100 million and change the course of the election in the United States, and then have everything you've always wanted. So everything is going to be done in this new sort of shadowy, asymmetric little green men money laundering, cyber attacking kind of way. And we have to grow up and get used to it. And all the old tools that we used to use, government sanctions against countries make no sense anymore. We need to go after the individuals. And the great thing about Russia is, I should say the worst thing about Russia is the fact that all the wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top 1,000 people, and everybody else lives in dire poverty. But that distortion creates this huge opportunity, which is since all their wealth is held by 1,000 people, and all those 1,000 people don't feel comfortable holding it in Russia because they want to hold it in the West where there's property rights, we can put that money at risk. And that's the beauty of targeted individual sanctions, and it's just so clear and so logical and so elegant a solution to this modern day Russian problem.
Yeah, and that's exactly the flip side. They're dependent on our property rights. We need to make sure that that's where we strike back.
And let me say one last thing before I don't want to dominate the conversation, but you can tell, for anybody who, Putin doesn't have a poker face in this whole thing. He's so mad about this for a reason. He's chasing me around the world with 7 Interpol arrest warrants for a reason. He's made it his single largest foreign policy priority to have the Magnitsky Act repealed for a reason, because we've got a direct hit. We found his Achilles heel, and so to come up with arguments not to do it is just doing ourselves a disservice.
Patrik?
Well, I do totally agree with you on going after those 1,000 people and their money. I think that would be a best asymmetrical response. I was going to quote Gudrun Persson from Swedish Defense Research Agency. She said, quote, something like this: "It's like you're having a soccer game and suddenly someone takes up the ball with their hands and starts to play rugby. And we are playing soccer, Russians are playing rugby. We need to adjust to that kind of game. And that's why we need these kind of asymmetrical responses." And my final reflection, and I don't totally agree with you on the military side, because what they could achieve is local superiority and fait accompli together with political division. Our strength is depending on us staying together, because divided we fall.
Olof?
Yes, I agree with you. It is a strong signal, and it's probably very efficient to target individuals. But we have rule of law, and we also have due process of law in a country like Sweden. And the tradition of administrative justice, of course, we have it. We have strong tax authorities and things like that. So there are possibilities, but it is not. It is complicated to take over the American tradition here.
But the British did it, and the Estonians did it, and the
Brits,
Latvians did it.
they have a different system as
The
well.
Canadians did. The Canadians did it. Everybody's got a different system. It's
So but I think it's important to understand that I agree with you that it is efficient, and we need to adapt to the fact to the threat. But I think also one should be aware of the fact that it's not only a question of bad will, that it takes a certain amount of time to do it here. With regard to lots of the money that is going out from Russia should, if they have stayed in Russia, gone to the military. So the issue of corruption is, of course, a great problem also for Russia. If the kickbacks are 40% or 50%,
80%.
80%. That means that when the figures we see, which are supposed to go to new equipment and exercises in Russia, are not the real figures, because lots of money is getting out of the system and transformed to Europe. So it is. There is, to a certain extent, it's not only evidence of strength that Russia has this problem. It's also an evidence of weakness, and of course I think that we can, in the long run, we will be able to fight them successfully. I'm not that pessimistic as Patrik, but we need to be realistic when we look at Russia and see this not only as a financial operation, it's really a question of politics.
On that note, no, Karin?
Yeah, I'd like to comment about the thing that Olof said about how Europe is being scattered between different groups, and about the Brexit campaign and how Russia is funding the Brexit campaign. And Bill mentioned before how Le Pen's party had been financed. I wondered, this is a room of enlightenment and reason, but how is it among the voters? Do they really know these things? Can you do something about that? Can you enlighten them? And I don't think the voters of Le Pen want to pass the way for Russia. Actually, I don't. So I think we could build our resistance to those kind of things through enlightenment, through reporting, through debates. Of course, there must be things we as a journalist, but also as citizens, that we can do. That is not about the money. That is about knowledge.
There's a really good example in America. There was a congressman from Orange County, California, named Dana Rohrabacher. And Dana Rohrabacher, he has the nickname Putin's favorite congressman. And he was the one member of Congress that was working with the Russians to try to have Magnitsky's name removed from the Global Magnitsky Act. And he actually traveled to Moscow and met with a bunch of sanctioned Russians, and God knows what else happened behind closed doors. But there was a congressional election in November of last year. And one of the key issues in Orange County was who was the candidate who supported Russia and who wasn't. And he was I think something like an 18-term congressman, and he got knocked out by a democratic process. He was a Republican, got knocked out by a Democrat in Orange County, which comes to your point, which is that these people may be doing things on a very venal, greedy basis for themselves, but it's not a long-term solution from a democratic process.
No, and that ties in. I'm going to probably quote you incorrectly, Patrik, but when you have described the Swedish far right, you've seen there's been a division among the neo-Karolins and the Putinists. So you see split in the far right from those who are more traditional, where Russia has always been the enemy, and you would not see that as something good. On the other hand, you see Russia's fascist international trying to court favors with extremists, well, on both sides, but in this particular one on the far right, as Marine Le Pen. And I think even to them, exposing this could be useful. I'm going to give you the word, Olof, but I'm just going to give one question to Bill to think about in the meantime. But what Karin asked was, well, how do we get this message across? And I know you've been working a lot on showing, this is actually where the money is. Is this too little in investigative power capacities in the media, or are we not interested because it feels in some way that it is there, but the action is lacking? What do you see the problem? I'm going to give Olof first a quick comment.
No, I think that Bill has done an enormous amount of good work with what you are doing. I mean, the way that we grasp these problems is very much a consequence of what you have done. And I think that is invaluable from the point that you raised. How do the public address and how do the public understand this? I think that we should use the means that we have. I think we should be working more with certifications. I mean, we have certifications on a number of things, ISO, etc., etc. I think we should have certifications of banks. Are they doing these kind of things, or are they not doing these kind of things? I think we should have a stricter certification of politicians. And we have much greater transparency with regard to campaign funding and all these issues that has been neglected for many years. I mean, we have seen actually those kind of legislation has been abolished in many countries, in US, for example. So I think that is it is necessary for us to be much more aware of the threat and draw the conclusions that we must not elect politicians that are corrupt, we must not have civil servants that are corrupt, and we must have certification on businesses which makes it gives us as consumers a transparent choice. Danske Bank was once upon a time also a very small bank called Ehrenkrona Bank. It was my family's house bank. It's very tragic to see what has happened. I will never put my money in the Danske Bank. Thanks to you.
I actually don't think we have such a big problem. Ever since I became involved in the human rights and sanctions and Magnitsky Acts and so on, I have lots of conversations with victims from all over the world. And I think that those of us on the front lines fighting Russia are actually in a very privileged place because Putin has done so much. I mean, he's done so much to draw attention to himself and to what Russia is doing. I meet these people from Turkey, for example. Turkey has got this horrible situation with Erdogan arresting anybody who's ever said one bad word about him everywhere around the world, trying to Interpol, and there's like 50,000 people, political prisoners in jail. Just a couple days ago, they had just convicted like 49 lawyers. It's doctors and judges and army generals and so on and so forth. And nobody cares about Turkey because they don't care about Turkey. And we're actually, 10 years ago when I first started dealing with all these issues, nobody cared about Russia, but they care about Russia now. I mean, the fact that this room is full and the fact that a lot of important journalists are here, I think that it's now really, it's a question of tightening up the noose, not shining a bright light. Everyone sort of knows what's going on now.
On that note, I'm going to open the floor. Thomas?
Thank you very much. I think we agree.
Please introduce yourself.
Sorry?
Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Thomas Bertelman, I'm retired ambassador from Foreign Ministry. Our institutions are under attack, and I think you all agree that a Russia policy begins at home to make ourselves less vulnerable. But I would like to ask Mr. Browder in particular, but also you, what about grand strategy when it comes to Russia? And the reason is that you mentioned that the force driving you is really to restore justice or create justice, and we can all understand why. But create justice is not enough as a strategy with a country like Russia. And everybody seems to be more or less at a loss right now. There is this debate in the US on a new containment or neo-containment and what would be the elements of that. And the concrete pieces are all sanctions. I saw a list from Congress, the various reasons for various sanctions. I think it was more than 20 different decisions on unrelated events that all had led to sanctions. But it's a very sort of atomized congregation of decisions without internal cohesion necessarily. And you had this brilliant idea of the 1,000 richest persons perhaps would do the trick. But I would like to invite you to think aloud on the role of sanctions at a more generalized level in a grand strategy for Russia.
So back during the Cold War, you had a communist country that was trying to, the Soviet Union was trying to expand communism around the world. And the strategy, the Western strategy, was a containment strategy, which was, containment in a lot of different areas, mostly military, but other areas as well. And then the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union dissolved, everybody kind of started looking the other way, and we thought we don't have to worry about them anymore. And it turns out that it's just morphed over that time period from a communist ideology to a criminal ideology. And Vladimir Putin he has no ideology other than to be a criminal. He's a kleptocrat. He's a grand kleptocrat. And his objective, his objective is not to raise Russia to the level of the rest of the world. His objective is to bring the rest of the world down to the level of Russia. And so the way he goes about doing that is through all these looking for weaknesses. And if you speak to anybody in the military about how they deal with Russia, the answer is you don't give them 1 inch anywhere, because once they have taken that, you can't get it back. And so effectively we have to, and you use the words yourself, you have to have a new containment strategy, but it's a criminal containment strategy, not a ideological containment strategy. But it doesn't mean you don't have the military involved. You have to build up your NATO boundaries so that and make it clear that one step over any place is going to cause them no end of pain. But you've got to do the same thing in the other areas, and money is the key. Money is, $1 trillion has left, $1 trillion of criminal money has left Russia. And of course it also gives us this great leverage. I've had all these government officials in the UK saying, we have no leverage. That's complete and utter nonsense. In the UK, every self-respecting Russian crook from the government has a big house in London. That's huge leverage.
And how has the process been in the UK? Because the UK has been very divided, let's say, over a tough response to Russia sanctions, whereas after the attempted murder of the Skripals, they've adapted a version of the Magnitsky Act. But how tough and how effective?
So in the U.S., there's more than 100 people. I think there's 90 people on the U.S. Magnitsky list. There's 71 on the Canadian Magnitsky list. There's 69 on the Lithuanian, 49 on Estonian, 49 on the Latvian, and 0 on the UK Magnitsky list. That kind of says it all.
That sums it up. And the Tories, how have their efforts been to sanitize their party from Russian donations?
Well, you read little snippets of some Russian here, some Russian there gave money at this conservative party thing or that conservative party thing. I don't think this is a Tory problem. I think it's a general problem. Let me just give you, in this particular example, is the Tory involved. So you have two lawmaking bodies in the United Kingdom. You have the lower house, the House of Parliament, or the House of Commons, and you have the upper House of Parliament, which is the House of Lords. And there's a guy named Lord Gregory Barker. He's the lawmaker. He's a member of the House of Lords. He's a conservative. He's a former energy minister. He makes laws. And he also happens, at the same time as he's making laws in the House of Lords, he sits on the board of Oleg Deripaska's company, EN+. And not only does he receives money from a Russian, but he's not only receiving money from a Russian, he's actively traveling the world using his lordship title in Washington and other places to very deliberately lobby against sanctions for Deripaska. I just can't fathom why that's not illegal. That a member of a lawmaking body in the UK can take money from a Russian and use his status to lobby policy, whether it's in the UK or any other country. It just makes no sense to me that that's possible.
That's a fantastic example. Olof?
The strategy, I think, must be a combination of criminal containment and political containment. But the political containment should probably be a bit different compared to it was after McKennan's letter. And what you're saying, it's exciting. It must be stigmatized to do these things.
Illegal.
Well, at least stigmatized. We have this problem in the Council of Europe,
Oh, yeah.
where we have many delegations that are absolutely totally corrupt and bought by caviar diplomacy, it's called. It's extremely important that we take the lead and say that this is not okay. From that point of view, it was very, very important decision that was taken by the EPP the other day to suspend Orban's party, Fidesz, because Orban's party is not there. It's not only a problem of that they are politically not in line with the fundamental values of the EPP. It's also a corruption problem in Hungary that we should not underestimate. And those things goes hand in hand. And it's very, very important that we have a strong Western alliance that say this is not okay. It was very good that we did not accept to have a Russian head of the Interpol. It was quite close.
I know.
It was quite close. But it was a strong signal to Moscow that the Western world said, no, that should not be the case. Maybe we should suspend Russia from the Interpol.
I agree.
And look what we should do because they are misusing the organization. I think we should be more systematically looking at these kinds of isolationist tactics in order to actually say that we do not accept that you are spoiling every international organization that you take part in. You have your veto in the Security Council, but
Yeah, I think Bill is probably the last one you need to convince to throw Russia out of Interpol. More questions from the floor. Dag, then Susanne.
Hi, my name is Dag Nyström. I'm a participant of the Free World Academy, and I also am a lawyer, and I'm working at a bank with these issues of money laundering and especially sanctions. So each Friday when I think it's about to go out to the after work, I receive this email from OFAC with this week's updates, so I'm quite familiar with them. But I would like to know more about how you did your investigations, Mr. Browder, because I mean we've all tried to implement these new regulations, although not the Magnitsky Act yet in Sweden, but the directives against money laundering. And I think what Mr. Hökmark was talking about here at the beginning about that we are usually focusing on maybe not the real big issues, but rather on filling out forms for whoever or all of the customers. So I would like to know more about what are your tips and hints for tracking down the real crooks in the investigations? Because when we read the newspapers now, they're talking about all these numbers and figures flowing in of illicit funds from the East into the European Union, as you mentioned, but it's still only about like allegations and suspected money laundering, but not many cases have come to conviction. So what makes you think that you have better evidence than everybody else, and could you please describe them more in detail? Thank you.
So the way in which we built up the case was to start with the crime. So the crime in our case was $230 million of illegal tax refund went from the Russian treasury into 3 Hermitage companies that had been stolen by this group of criminals. And then once it went into those companies, then it was then quickly dispersed from those companies through a network of Russian banks. And interestingly, the way we got that information from about the Russian banks was that after we exposed the $230 million crime, the Russian government needed to, they couldn't just leave it uninvestigated. So they got 2 of the lowest level crooks, the guy with the murder conviction and somebody else who was an ex-convict, to come forward and plead guilty. And they don't have guilty pleas per se. They have this sort of simplified prosecutions. So these two individuals came forward. They had a criminal case. They had a trial. They found them guilty. But the Russians actually, in the process, put together the entire money flow from those banks to the Russian border in those cases. And then the Russians did something very stupid, which was they accused Sergei Magnitsky after he was killed of being involved in the theft. And so his family got access to the case file. And so with that information, we were able to trace the money to the Russian border, and it's just clearly, I mean, it was just a question, and they have all the wire transfers in their case file. And then an organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project got hold of the Moldovan bank. The money went to Moldova first, and they got the Moldovan case file. And from that, we were able to trace the money through Moldova to Cyprus, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And from that, we filed criminal complaints with the authorities in each of those countries. And from a number of those countries, we then were able to participate in the criminal cases and got information on the wire transfers from those countries to other countries. And we filed criminal complaints with other countries. And then we got access to the case files in those countries. And so we know exactly where the money is. And so the only question is can law enforcement prosecute? I was told, for example, we went to Denmark in 2013 and complained about money from this crime going to Denmark, and the Danish authorities refused to open a criminal investigation. And then Danske Bank came out in 2018. They did open a criminal investigation, and I went earlier this year to meet with the state prosecutor in Denmark, and I said, what are you going to do about these things that we identified? And they said, we can't prosecute them. They're beyond the statute of limitations, 5 years. So had they acted 5 years ago, we would have been fine. And so you can't equate the lack of prosecution with the lack of money laundering. All you can say is that, and I think at the end of the day, we're only going to be able to see a very small fraction of all the stuff being exposed, leading to arrests and prosecution. But we will see arrests and prosecutions.
Yeah. I'm looking around and I'm seeing some faces that are looking mostly thirsty. We're going to give one last question to Susanne, and then we're going to give the panel a last word. So.
Yes, I'm Susanne Oksanen, and I'm an economist, and I also worked in Moscow in the 90s. I think the 90s was much more fun than it is now. I'm now with the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I'm very grateful that you've done all this job to really trace this money, because nobody else has the time or money to do it. So it's a very great, it's great to have somebody to refer to when you have to refer to these things. So it's very interesting, both your book and what you've said today. However, what I'm asking about is, Putin is the richest man in the world. What do you know about his money? Where is it, and how has he placed it? Thank you.
That's an excellent question.
Well, in fact, this is a question that's now been posed by the U.S. Congress. The most recent Russia sanctions law, which was passed in the House and still has to go to the Senate, asks exactly to map out Putin's wealth. So I'll give you a few anecdotes, but we can wait for this great congressional investigation as well. Putin doesn't keep any money in his own name. The reason that he doesn't keep any money in his own name is that if he did, then whoever had that document could blackmail him as a corrupt official by having a document showing that he kept the money in his own name. And so he has what's commonly known as a trust agreement. And a trust agreement means that the person who he has the agreement with he's got to trust them to hold the money for him. And he has a trust agreement with a number of many people in Russia, oligarchs and other people. The most granular story of one of these trust agreements came out through the Panama Papers, which was the story of the famous cellist Sergei Roldugin. Sergei Roldugin was one of Putin's best friend from childhood, the godfather of Putin's daughter, and this cellist from Mariinsky Orchestra. And within the Panama Papers, it was disclosed that he had accumulated through a network of companies that he controlled $2 billion. And what was most remarkable about it was that all the oligarchs were paying him investment advisory fees of $70 million here and $100 million there to a cellist for investment advice. And he was doing trades of Rosneft shares where he would never buy a share or sell a share. They would just find out the lowest price he could have bought it at during a day and the highest price he could have sold it at, and that was the transaction that he did. And they never bought or sold a share, just gave him the difference. Some brokerage houses did it, and many, many other things. And $2 billion. And this is just one leak from one trust company in Panama of one person. And so, so there's no reason why Sergei Roldugin would be worth $2 billion. Why would oligarchs give Sergei Roldugin $2 billion? They wouldn't. There's another really great story, which is Putin's daughter married the son of one of Putin's best friends, a guy named Shamalov. And when they got married, the son was given a gift of I think $2 or $3 billion worth of shares in a company called Sibur Energy. It just like transferred to him literally within moments. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out so great, and 2 years later they were divorced. And then those shares were transferred back to the oligarch who transferred it to them. This is how Putin's wealth is held by people who he trusts. And so, but it comes to a really important point, which is that, and this is a point that comes back to the whole sanctions, which is if you sanction the richest oligarchs in Russia, you're actually sanctioning Vladimir Putin. And when the United States sanctioned 7 of the richest oligarchs on April 6th of last year, it had a devastating effect. Oleg Deripaska was one of them. He's just announced in a lawsuit that he lost 90% of his net worth. This is one thing, and every time we kick out a bunch of diplomats, they kick out diplomats, there's always a tit for tat. This is the one thing where Putin didn't say a word, because he understood that if he started like lashing out, they would sanction another 7 oligarchs. And there's absolutely nothing, Putin has no response that's in any way symmetrical to that.
That's a very good answer to the question. Final thoughts, panel?
Well, I'll start then. And very, very briefly, we need to take actions and take these things serious, and it's urgent.
Well, one reflection is that I came to think about a review I wrote of Bill Browder's book. And a day later, I wrote another review in a big Swedish newspaper, and it was describing Bill Browder as, you know, he was such a big crook, just as Putin. He wasn't better. He had stolen as much money as Putin had. So these Russian narratives are present in our in Swedish public life, and I think we have to be a bit more aware of that to be able to detect those fake stories. And another reflection is that to follow the money as a journalist, it's very hard. We had a young man from a bank, the lawyer. You said that this is very complex material, and it's very challenging for journalists to do this job. We saw the TV programs about Swedbank. It was a lot of pictures of journalists' writings, you know, trying to explain this really complex money transfers. It's so hard to do the storytelling about this. And I think that is actually scaring journalists, because it takes too much time. It's so complex to build a story around it. So that's, I think that leads to that we do these kinds of things not as often as we should do. So that is some reflections from me, from my perspective, after this conversation.
Thank you. Olof?
Well, to answer your question about what shall we do, we'll stop searching for the crooks under the street lights, because they are not there. You should look for the crooks in the dark corners. And the problem with the legislation and with what the authorities tell the bank is that you are supposed to put in lots of resources to study Gunnar Hökmark's bank account and his family. and you don't care a shit of what happens in Deutsche Bank or Cyprus or etc. So we are actually allocating our resources in the wrong directions right now. And this is not the, I would say, the banks are not the big problem here in that sense. It's actually authorities and the legislation. Because when the Finansinspektionen tells you that you should know every customer you have, which have some sort of relationship to any politician or governmental authority, when they tell you that you are going to do this, they get you to believe that you are doing enough, and they think themselves that they are doing enough, while they actually let the big fish go around those dark waters, just as they always have done. So I think it's extremely important that we understand that we must allocate our resources on the big problem, and the big problem is these billions and billions and billions of dollars that is circulating in the European laundromats. And this is basically an issue for the EU. I mean, the Bundesregierung, the German government must look seriously into the problems that are connected to Deutsche Bank. The EU Council must put on the Commission, must put pressure on Cyprus and Malta. And we need to address the problem where it really is. And this is, of course, the Americans are much better on that. The American authorities are much tougher on this. Then it comes to the next problem, which Bill addressed. I think that is also a big problem, that those who are responsible do more or less go free, or they lose their jobs, while the shareholders and the pension funds and all the investors in those banks, they are going to pay the price if we are successful. But that is a bit different, a different story. But I think we must be much more, in Weber's terms, goal rational when it comes to this. We are not rational according to the goals we have right now. And this is a legislative problem, and it's also a problem for the authorities to actually allocate their resources in the right directions.
Thank you very much, Olof. And also add, of course, that Sweden should work for the EU to do this. Not only the EU should do this. Final words, Bill?
I've said so much today, I'll leave it at that.
Great. To sum it up, we have a rough idea what to do and where to do it. And there's a lot of hard work in front of us. But before that, there's a lot of wine. So please join us, thank the panel, and come out to the Salan on here.